Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today no matter what it is you're doing. For the free wire tutorial today, I'd like to share with you my dragon scale wire netting pendant design. Now it's a variation on standardised netting using wire, but it does have this really lovely pointy aspect, and I always think it looks a little bit like dragon scales. So why don't we head down to the board and have a closer look at what we're going to make together, and then we can discuss how you can take this project further in a future video. So in my hands I'm showing the piece that we're going to make together today. I've used a dragon style glass eye cabochon. Now these are super affordable on my Monday night crystal sales. If you ever fancy anything like this, just let me know, drop me a message either here or on Instagram or Facey and I can organise one of these for you. They're super affordable, but you can use any rounded cabochon that you like for the same effect. I'm going to be using this particular beautiful purple sparkly one next week in a slightly more extended variation of today's tutorial, and this was kindly sent to me by the lovely Anne Nishioka from California, so thank you Anne, that's coming up next time around. And indeed next time around this is one of the variations of the dragon eye pendant which I'm going to be sharing with you, and that's next week. But for today we're going to create our own little dragon scale netted wire cabochon pendant. So let's pop that up into the corner. And I think I'm going to work with the green dragon's eye and leave the rounded pupil for another day. So in terms of wire, we're just going to be using 2 wires. I do like to try and keep things as simple as possible to make these designs accessible to beginners to the art and craft of wirework jewellery. So I have to begin with around about 12 inches of that 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and the first thing I'm going to do is smooth and warm that through, especially that central area, which is where we're going to be working to begin with. So lovely fluid heat in that design to begin with, and if you have a round object that's just slightly larger than your cabochon, that would be fantastic. Now my mandrel's just slightly smaller, however the tendency with wire is that it will spring out a little bit anyway. So I'm looking to get a circular form in the centre of that wire. It's a little bit too small, but I'm going to show you how you can tease that out without having to have a huge array of large rounded mandrels. So because we warmed that through to begin with, I'm just going to allow that to gently unfurl at either end and just use the curvature of my thumbs just to open that out slightly until it's a little larger than the cabochon itself. So just by manual manipulation, we've just got that to open up slightly. And then what we're going to do is to create a pair of right angle bends up at the top centre of that wire. And they need to be really quite close together because for this design I'm creating a very simple bail. This is just a figure of 8 weave, and it just connects back round to the frame itself. And that's another reason you do need the circular form to be larger than the cab itself. So this is not quite large enough yet, so I'll just tease that ever so slightly open. And 12 inches is probably much more wire than we need, but it makes it much easier when we're trying to wrap everything together later. So that's a perfectly reasonable size to be working with. So I'm just going to pop another right angle bend up here at that 12 o'clock position. Now, I haven't completely centralised that wire, but I'm not overly stressed out about that at this stage. What I will do though, let's just scooch him out of the way so I don't scratch it, is get those angles completely 90 degrees up at the top. So I'm just going to straighten those slightly and then pull the wire apart for when we do that figure of 8 weaving. So that's our base position of starting, and that's pretty much how most of my pendants begin with. The shape rather that most of my pendants begin with is just an oversized frame around the piece that we're working with those upright bends up at the top. So what we need now is some lighter gauge wire. Now you can work with a slightly heavier wire if you desire, but for this design I do like to work with quite a fine wire. So this is 0.4mm or 26 gauge. Very good idea to take that up to 0.5mm or 24 gauge. But for the first time you make it, it's nice to be able to do it with a really easy to manipulate wire. So maybe the first time try this slightly lighter wire. I'm going to start over at one end of that 24-inch length. and I'm going to wrap around about 3 times around the frame. Now if you're left dominant, you might like to start over on the right hand side and work around. My preference is always to start over on the left hand side, and that's simply because it's easier for me to manipulate my pliers with my right hand and bring that coil around the framework. Now you can do that by hand, or you can get your pliers to help you out. It's a little bit dull to watch me just getting started, and if you're a knitter, it's a little bit like just casting on. You need somewhere to start. So I'm going to take that tail of wire all the way around at least 3 times when I'm working with this 0.4mm gauge wire. That's exactly 3 times, and I'm just going to rotate the pliers whilst holding the wire coils still. Allow those pliers to rotate around, and you'll just get a nice smooth end on that section. So what we want to do now is to twist it round to make it easiest for ourselves. So I'm going to flip that up the other way, and then I'm going to draw the wire so that it sits inside the frame that we've created. So what I'm going to do now is use whatever pair of pliers makes you happy. I'm going to switch to my standard chain nose pliers. And the reason for that is that I've got a little bit of permanent marker pen on the pliers already. If you don't have a tapered set that you wanted to put a marker pen on, you could use a flat chisel set and do the same sort of thing. Anything that's got flat faces on the jaws is ideal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the wire from one side of the frame. At the moment it's underneath, so I'm going to draw that all the way up and through. Ideally we're not handling this lighter gauge wire too much because you can weaken it. We're going to scooch that coil all the way up against the right angle we made, and I'm going to now use the mark on my pliers to create a line at which we're going to turn a corner. So if I hold this up, you can see that the wire is sitting against the mark I've made, and the pliers are sitting against the inside edge of that frame. I'm going to push firmly so that we get a triangular shape. Now what we need to do is to have the wire travelling from underneath the frame to on top. If your wire is loaded on and it's going over the top, then you simply reverse that to take the wire down through the middle so that it follows underneath. As long as you're switching from underneath to on the top, or vice versa, it's all good. So for the first row, and I'm going to do 2 rows in this design of that beautiful dragon scale netting, what I want to do is to hold that triangular form. So I'm looking to have equal sides here. I'm going to pinch that very, very firmly whilst I bring the wire over the top of the frame, all the way around and up the middle. Again, I'm trying to handle the wire as little as possible. I don't want to put too much heat into it. And I've rotated all the way around the frame 1 time. Now, because I've started off with 3 wraps, I kind of like to keep it with the same number of wraps going all the way around. But if you prefer a slightly narrower aesthetic, let me just push the wire through again, all the way around that frame, up through the middle, draw that through, handling it as little as possible, and then pulling it back inside the centre of that frame wire. So again, my fine wire has wrapped around the frame and it is currently sitting with the wire coming away underneath. I'm going to bring my pliers back in. I've got 2 wraps, and I think we'll go for 2 wraps all the way around. If you want to match the beginning point, you can go for 3 wraps. You don't have to have more than that if you don't want to. I think we'll go for 2 wraps and just see what that looks like at the end. On the example piece, just here, I've gone for 3 wraps around the outside, so you can kind of take a look at it and choose which you think will be nicer for your design. So I'm going to bring my pliers back into play. I'm going to find that marker pen. I'm going to pinch that finer gauge wire firmly and turn a very firm angle using the edge of my pliers to make that triangle shape. Now you'll notice that the angle inside my triangle or pyramid is different. So I'm just going to support that angle I've created, push the wire over a little bit more. If you kink that at all, just take a second to straighten the wire up before you continue. And I'm looking to replicate this design all the way around the inside of the frame. So I'm going to do 2 more with you, and then I'll continue off screen until I've gone all the way around the edge. So I've created the triangle form. I'm going to pinch the triangle form, push the wire all the way around the frame once, and then a second time, trying to warm this finer gauge wire as little as possible. And then I'm going to make sure that the wire sits inside the frame. And what you'll see, as long as you're crossing from underneath to over the top, you'll always return to the same side you started on. And that's kind of key for my design of the dragon scale to work. So I'm going to show you one more time and then I'll continue all the way around off camera. So I'm going to pop my pliers in, line up that finer gauge wire with the marker pen. So I can just hold that for you there and then push a sharp angle over the edge of those pliers. Very, very gently retract the pliers out of the way. You've got your third triangle, and what you might notice is it's moved along slightly. So you can just scooch that gently and carefully, trying to retain the distance between those winds, those little coils on the frame wire. Retaining the distance will ensure that your angles remain the same. Now you might notice it's slightly soft, just the angle inside the first pyramid or the first triangle. I'll show you how to fix that once I've created this third little triangle or dragon scale. So let's pinch that firmly into position, drawing the wire all the way through. Pull that all the way through, and then for a second time. And I'm just going to lay that up inside the frame for the moment. And I'm just going to use my nails to tighten those coils up, or you could use a pair of pliers if you wish. Now, if you have got a slightly soft angle inside one of those triangles, you can use any flat-facing pliers. I'm using a tapered tip here, so that I can get right inside the tips of those triangles and just make sure that I'm happy with all of those. If you prefer, continue all the way around and then do a little bit of retro fixing. So I'm going to continue until I get to the other end, and then I'll meet you back here in just a moment. So I've continued with those little dragon scale shaped nettings all the way around, and I've just stopped shy of the top angle that we created. So if I pop you down to the board, I'll show you how to move on to the next row of dragon scales. So I've continued creating those lovely pyramids of dragon scale all the way around the inside of the frame there. And like I said earlier, you can just play around with how they sit, trying to keep them even in terms of size and angle. If you need to, you can just fine up those angles by very, very gently putting a little bit of pressure with the tip of your pliers. Now I've stopped just shy of that top 12 o'clock angle, which will turn into a bail later. If you find that you're right up hard against the edge, you can very gently condense the triangles down until you get a little bit of a space. And what we're looking for is the distance between the beginning wrap and the last time you wrapped around the frame to be about the same as the distance between one of the dragon scale little triangle bases all the way around that frame. So you might need to open it up slightly, you might need to close them up slightly, whatever works for you. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to flip this back up the other way. So you can see my wire continues to be starting on the underside of that frame. I'm now going to create a final little dragon scale on this row. So I'm going to refer to the mark on my pliers to get that distance. You could use a ruler if you wanted. And I'm going to create a little right angle up at the top. It's slightly stronger than a right angle actually. And just turn that over so that I've got that final, hopefully matching dragon scale triangle. Let's pop those pliers out of the way for a second. What I'm going to do now is to lay my finer gauge wire over the top of the frame just before the point at which we started that very first wrap. So if I pinch firmly, draw the wire all the way around once and push it up that central aperture, and then just push that very, very firmly so that it sits against the first wrap that we created. What I want to do now is to bring the wire end into play, and you can see here that my finer gauge wire has come up between the first dragon scale and the last dragon scale. What I want to do now is to take the very end of my finer gauge wire and post it down through that first dragon scale. Now your wire has seen a little bit of action, so you'll need to go slowly and perhaps pop a digit or a thumb in there just to allow that to scooch down inside that first dragon scale that we made. And then I'm going to push the wire back up through the central aperture, and I'm going to repeat the same technique. So taking the tail of my wire down inside that very first dragon scale, and I'm just going to support that as I carefully pull the wire all the way through. I don't want to disrupt the shape of my dragon scale, and I don't want to stress out this finer gauge wire. Now it's only taken me 2 wraps around the first side of that very first dragon scale or pyramid shape to get all the way to the tip of that first dragon scale shape. It may take you 3 wraps. It depends on how neatly you can bring that wire around the first line. Let's just push that gently up through the centre. What we're going to do to move on now to the second layer of dragon scales is exactly the same technique, but instead of wrapping twice around the frame, we're going to be wrapping once inside the pointed section of the next adjacent dragon scale. So let's make the mark just a little bit higher up those pliers. I don't have my pen to hand, but I'm going to remember that it's about 2.5 millimeters away from the first mark. We want these next row of scales to be just a little bit smaller. So my wire again is underneath, and it's coming from underneath the tip of that first dragon scale. So I'm going to put my pliers into play to make a triangular shape, a little smaller than the first. So push that wire firmly over, and it's come from underneath to over the top of the whole design. What I'm going to do now is bring the tip, the end of that finer gauge wire, inside the next adjacent dragon scale. So pushing that all the way down for now, allowing that to very, very softly move through. The reason I put my thumb in here is it stops it looping, and finer gauge wire will want to do that. So we want to control the shapes, we want to control the angles, and keep everything really pointy. Now, I don't know if dragons have rounded scales or pointed scales, but I really love making this design, so I've decided to call it the Dragon Scale Netting. So once we've got the next small layer, the first one is set, I'm going to just pinch that very, very firmly and draw that finer gauge wire away from me. So what you can do to make your life easier is just gently pinch that together, not with tools, but just with your fingers. This is a very light wire, 0.4 or 26 gauge. So I'm going to support that next little dragon scale whilst I draw the wire all the way up through, again trying to handle it as little as possible. And I'm going to repeat that all the way around. So in very gently pinching the wire as it sits through the next adjacent dragon scale, you've set the size of that dragon scale. So I'm going to repeat the exact same design. The finer gauge wire is underneath the first dragon scale that we've used, and I'm going to create another triangle, hopefully the same kind of size. If I hold my pliers just like so, you'll see the process a little bit easier, but you'll need to kind of measure. So I'm going to push that wire all the way back so that we get another triangle of a similar size. And then we're going to do the exact same technique again, taking the tip down through the next adjacent dragon scale, supporting that with a digit just to ensure that it doesn't kink. Now you can see that the wire is getting a little bit tired. Now the benefit of using that slightly heavier wire I suggested as an alternative, we're working with 0.4 or 26 gauge. If you work with 0.5mm or 24 gauge, it's slightly harder to get it to do the pointy sections exactly how you want it to, but it kinks slightly less. So it's down to you which wire you wish to use. I'm demonstrating today with that 0.4 or 26 gauge. So again, I've taken a look at my little triangle or my second smaller dragon scale. I'm happy with both the angles and the sizes, the distances of the sides of the triangle. I'm going to pinch that firmly and draw the wire up and away from me. When I'm happy and certain that that looks exactly how I want it to, I'm going to give that a little pinch to set the size of that triangle. All I will do now is my second row of dragon scales, and with a nice slender cab like this glass cabochon with a printed dragon's eye on the back, these are super affordable, it's very, very easy to just use the 2 layers. These are not teeny tiny little triangles that I'm using, but what I'm going to do is continue all the way around to the end, and then I'll show you how you can finish off that second row. So I've completed my second row of dragon scales, and I'll show you how you can finish off that weave and begin a little figure of 8 weave to make a simplified veil. So you can see I've continued on all the way around that inside layer with my second row of dragon scales. Now we've used 24 inches of that 0.4 or 26 gauge wire for approximately a 30mm or 1 1/4 inch cabochon. If you're going to use a much larger cabochon, you may like to go for a third row of then even smaller dragon scales, or you may like to use significantly more wire to achieve that. So I've got the first half of that last scale done. I've created the right angle up at the top there, and instead of bringing the tail of wire through just at the tip of the next triangle to move all the way around, I need to bring that down inside the tip of the first triangle on the first layer. So let me just tilt that in the light. Where we started off, that's where we're heading, inside that first triangle on the first layer. Just controlling that wire so it doesn't kink in any way. Bring that down into position, and again I'm just going to play around with that slightly to ensure I'm happy with all of those triangles. And then I'm going to pinch that final triangle on the second row very firmly. What I might do, just to save my fingers and to save your visual experience, is trim to about 1 inch of wire. And I'm going to employ my fine taper-tipped pliers here. What I want to do is, do you remember how we came up the first triangle side with that little coil of wire? We're going to do the same thing, but downwards on that first triangle. So I'm going to push the wire down inside the first triangle on the first layer, and then I'm going to draw the end of that wire up inside the triangle on the next layer up. So if I just pull that gently through, we're going to wrap around the downward slope on the first triangle where we very beginning started this process. So I'm going to wrap around that wire by pushing again down through that first triangle, and I'm still supporting this last triangle on the second row. If you pull very, very sharply here, you may knacker your wire, as they say. So I'm going to get quite a nice firm grip with that first turn around the down slope. And then I'm going to bring the tail up again inside, pull that all the way around, and take the tip down again inside the very first triangle. You might like to push the wire through at this stage instead of pulling it. It may not be the easiest thing, but it is worth taking your time to make sure that that's super neat and tidy. Now, I like to finish off by wrapping around the frame because that's where the strength is in this design. So I'm going to turn this upside down for a second, and I'm going to bring the tail of wire back inside that very first triangle around the frame itself. Bring the very, very tip of that tail all the way down inside the first triangle, pulling that round sharply once, and you'll see that we've got 2 complete tied off rows, and that very first triangle has got some spirals of the finer gauge wire travelling around it. Now it's a little bit of a technique, winding 26 gauge 0.4mm around 26 gauge 0.4mm. You need quite a delicate touch, but it is very much worth it. So I'm going to finish off with 3 wraps at least around that frame wire, just to ensure that the beginning and end of my wire are nice and secure. So in order to stop the wire from scratching or catching, I'm going to trim that just past the top, very carefully looking to make sure I'm trimming the correct wire, and then I'm going to push the end of the wire down inside the design. Give that a little pinch and it's done. So we've got our 2 rows now of that dragon scale design. What I'm going to do off camera now is a little bit of figure of 8 weave just up on the basic bail that we're going to make. So I want these 2 wires to be perfectly side by side. Now, of course, you can make a much more fancy bail than I am going to do. That is completely up to you how you want that to work out. But I'm going to do some tram lines there so they're nice and straight and nice and side by side. Very, very gentle application of pressure there just to give it a little more strength. Basic figure of 8 weaving, there's a video for that, so you can check that out if you need to. Otherwise, it's just wrapping the same number of wires on either side, alternating over and under in a figure of 8. And then once I've done that, I'll come back to you and show you how you can make a very, very simple bail. So I actually just used that offcut of wire from my original 24 inches of fine to create a slightly open figure of 8 weave. If you're going to completely fill around about 1.5 inches or so of the neckline wire here, I would say allow probably 12 inches or so of 0.4 or 26 gauge, whatever you've used for your dragon scales, and then it will match in really nicely. I'll show you now how to make the simplest bail ever, and then we can move on to how to house your dragon's eye in this lovely dragon scale netting. As I said, I've just used a scrap of wire to make a little bit of open weaving, but if you want a tighter, neater weave, allow yourself around 12 inches of that 0.4 or 26 mil gauge wire. So the first thing I'm going to do, I've designated that this is the front of my design. There's very little in it. I just think that this is a slightly neater looking side. So I'm going to bring the neckline wires or the bail wires forwards away from the frame, just above that angle change. So I'm going to support the circular form and bring those wires forwards. It doesn't need to be a very strong angle, dependent of course on how wide, on how large you want that bail aperture to be. So I'm going to grab my 6-piece bail makers, my 6 size bail makers, probably going to use number 5 today, and just rotate the wires around that bail and just flop them over the back for the moment. So I haven't managed to fill completely all the way around, so if I was making this and I wanted to wear it straight away, I would probably just make a slightly smaller bail aperture. But for me, for today, I'm just going to leave that little bit at the back naked, so there's not going to be any weaving on it and I'm not going to worry about it. What I'm going to do is look at the back of the pendant now, make sure that that bail is on straight. If it's not, you can use your bail makers or whatever round form you've chosen, such as a pencil for instance, just to get that nice and straight so that both sides are good and even. So I'll just pop that back in and just make sure that I'm happy with how that looks. And then I'm going to trim the wire around about 1/2 inch past the point that it crosses that bail top angle. Those can go into the scrap pot for later. And what we need to do is apply a little bit of warmth to that last little section of wire, just to make it as fluid as one possibly can. Now this is the cheatiest, easiest bail that I ever have made, and what I'm going to do is use that little triangle that stages over both sides. Let me just flip it to the front. This is the triangle I'm going to use to hide away the ends of my bail wire. So I'm going to estimate where I think the bend will need to take place to hit that angle. So if I draw that wire back slightly, just a little bit, and push the wire forwards, I'll do both sides at the same time, and just get them to go through the triangle that bridges the gap between the two sides of that bail wire. I'm then going to employ my bail makers just to make sure that I don't ruin the shape of the bail as I push those wires all the way through and inside that middle triangle on the frame. So if I withdraw those bail makers again, you can see how easy this is going to be. So the left wire I'm going to open up gently towards the left and the right gently to the right, like so. And I'm just going to push them by hand, little by little, to make sure again that I don't ruin the shape of that bail. I've just slightly offset it, so I'm going to pop the bail makers or whatever round form I'm using back in, and just push those wires back through to make sure that everything stays good and true. I'm going to hold on to that by hand while I just push those wires over the back. Again, just checking to make sure everything is all good and true. That all looks okay for today. You can take a little bit more time obviously to make that super neat and tidy, and then I'm going to further trim away a little bit on either side, and I'm taking that down to less than 1/8 of an inch now. Let's just get that wire out of the way. And all I want to do is to crimp that around the frame wire. So if I show you that on the side, you can see it's hooked onto the frame. And I'm just going to carefully and slowly bring that back around and push it around the frame wire. So you can see it's already gone around one time. And I'm going to take that very, very last little tail so that it sits inside the frame, and then I will do exactly the same on the other side, trying with all my might to keep it looking even on both sides. So I will grab those trusty bail makers. If you can't get your original size in, just take the next size down, because it will still help you just to hold that nice and straight whilst you tighten up that last little pinch. This is probably the easiest bail I think I've ever made. You're just literally taking that wire around the frame and making sure that the end sits inside the frame wire like so. So if we flip that over, you can see this is the front of the design. Very, very simplistic bail. This is one that I took just a little longer to make, so it can be super neat and tidy. This is my demonstration piece for today. Now let's get on to the last leg of today's video tutorial, which is fitting that dragon's eye cabochon. It looks absolutely super with septarian nodule agate as well, because I think that looks like a natural dragon's eye. I'm going to use my domed glass cabochon now just to push forwards into that frame. And this is again why we need that additional space around the frame between the edge of the cab and the actual frame itself. Now if I flip this sideways, you'll see that we've made a lovely little housing for that cabochon. So let's just pop that back in. Sometimes you can just suspend them and they sit there through tension alone. And obviously that's not the safe way to sell your jewellery or gift your jewellery, but it does demonstrate that there is a little bit of tension there, which is what we're looking for. What I want to do at this stage is just push down on all of these joints to make sure that nothing feels jagged. What you may like to do as well at this stage is release the cabochon and then very, very gently pull each of these points into the centre. And I'm doing that very, very softly indeed. I don't want to break the wire that I've woven. This is somewhat similar to a weave that you can do, sort of a Viking knitting. It's not dissimilar in how it all loops together. So you can see I'm just taking the time to bring every point on every scale as far forwards as possible. I'm also just going to use my thumbnail to soften down the points on the first row of dragon scales. So once that all feels nice, I can pop my cab back into position and then just drop that down, face down onto the desk. Now we do need another length of that finer gauge wire. So I'm going to work with around about a 12-inch length of 0.4 or 26 gauge wire, which I just cut from the reel. Let's plop that cabochon back out for a second. If you have managed to unrounden, which is not a technical term, if you've managed to squish the shape of your frame a little bit, you can take a second just to make sure that you're delighted with how that looks before you sew the cabochon into position. And that's what we're going to do next. So let's drop the cab down. Find a point at which you'd like to cast on. Now, because we've got quite a lot going on one side, this is where we started, I'm going to cast on the other side, and I'm going to do a very similar thing, which is just to wind on around about 3 times around that frame wire. Now you do need to have some good tension here, but we can start off by wrapping around a little bit more loosely. Obviously we're trying to not disrupt the shape of the dragon scales that we've created, nor the shape of the frame itself, because that's kind of key. So I think I might be going for 4 turns around this juncture, and I want to ensure that the very tail of the wire is nice and smooth to that frame. So if I just draw the wire outwards and away and just push that little coil, I'm going to tilt it like so. And if I can't see a sharp end sticking up, I know I've done a good job. I will just tighten that coil up neatly. We'll pop the dragon's eye cab back in. Now you do have the capacity to twist it slightly, so if it goes in and the eye isn't exactly where you want it to be, you should be able to fix that a little bit later. So what we're going to do is a nice swooping arc shape on the back, point to point on the frame itself. So I'm just going to use my finger to apply a little bit of circular motion. It's obviously not a circle, but it's part of a circle, it's an arc. And I'm going to draw the tail around the outside of the frame, just between one of those baselines, like so. I moved my camera earlier, sorry about that, slightly out of view for a hot second. So there we've got the wire starting up on one side, a nice little arc shape, and it's going to move point to point around that frame. So I'm bringing the wire up inside the frame wire, but what I'm going to do is take that to the north above where the wire's coming in. So if I allow that to just push through, and then get a little bit of tension on it. I want that arc shape to be there. In and of itself at the moment, there's no way that that's going to hold. So what we're going to do is continue all the way around, crossing over at this point each time. So I'm going to jump to the next available bar 1. So I could go in here, that would be too small. You can see the points at which those initial triangle dragon scales appear. So I'm going to take the wire through, bringing the tail above where it exits, like so. So we're looping around, and again, this is a little bit like a weave that is sometimes known as knitting, Viking knitting, that kind of thing. So let's just put a little bit of a smooth arc in there again. Take the tail up between the frame and the cab, missing one of those dragon scales, going on to the second dragon scale available, pulling that neatly into position, getting a little bit of tension, not too much, and then we're going to do the exact same thing. So skip a triangle, move into the next available gap, push the wire up and through, like so. All the way around, skipping until we hit next to where we started. Again, I want the wire to be coming up closer to its start point, like so. And then we're going to do a second round robin rather, and they're just going to cross over randomly. So I'm going to pull the wire up inside now, again passing between the frame and that cabochon, pulling it into position, and then I'm going to just sort of skip opposite here. 1 to go. Let's just pull that slightly tighter, bringing the wire up and through. If you run out of wire, you can always add on a little bit more. This is going to be quite close for me. Take the wire up inside like so. Push that little arc down against the back of your cabochon. And we're going to finish off just in here. Possibly we might have enough wire just for one more little arc. If we do, it would be perfect. We do, happy days. So that's going to finish wherever you can on the frame. It's a little bit busy just there, so I'm just going to push that over very, very gently. Take that wire up inside between the frame and the cab. Let me just grab a pair of pliers to help me here. Pulling that nice and firmly, and you've got a really good, strong grip on your cabochon on the rear side. And I will finish off, as always, with 3 wraps around that frame. So that's 1 turn around the frame, that's a second, and I'm just going to push that last tiny section of wire up in there, pulling that neatly into position, not crossing those wires over, always coiling, not doubling up. And then once you've got a really neat, tight finish, you can trim away that last little tail. So making sure that you're cutting only the wire that you want to cut, because it's kind of sad if you've got to do it all again. And then we're just going to make sure that that last little section is hidden away between the frame and the cabochon. So if we bring that back to the front, you can see my dragon's eye has indeed twisted, but you can move it around. And I'm doing that by pinching the front and the back, both of which are accessible, like so. So I absolutely adore this design. I think they're loads of fun, and they don't actually take that long to do. It's a great technique as well to get more au fait with that Viking style netting or webbing, however you want to think of it. Also, I have a video from a very long time ago now about my DreamWeaver design, which is using little rainbow or arc shapes to make a Dreamcatcher inspired design. You could do exactly the same thing here. You could make a Dreamcatcher or a DreamWeaver with those more angular dragon scales. So I hope you've enjoyed the dragon scale wire netting design pendant today. Next week I'm going to show you how you can make it slightly more elaborate if you want to. This is a perfect starting point for a more elaborate design. And I'm going to go for a little bit of a dragon's eye. A little bit more swirly, a little bit more fancy. So I hope you can join me then. Have yourself a fantastic week, and I'll see you soon. I'm Gem Hawks. Thanks for watching.